Hi, I'm Richard Roberts, and I'm the author of a book that has just been published called When Britain Went Bust, the 1976 IMF Crisis. In the autumn of 1976, 40 years ago this autumn, Britain was spellbound by an unfolding financial and political crisis. It began on the 28th of September when Denis Healey made a dramatic turnaround from Heathrow Airport, where he was en route to the IMF annual meetings. The crisis has four strands. First of all, it was a currency crisis. Healey at Heathrow heard that sterling was collapsing, and so he went back to the Treasury. And the next day made an application for a $3.9 billion loan to the International Fund, the biggest ever loan made at the time. Now, sterling had had plenty of currency crises in the previous 20 years, but what was different about 1976 was that since June 1972, the pound had been floating. That meant that in theory you couldn't have a currency crisis under a floating rate. The rate just depreciated. But what seemed to be happening in the autumn of 1976 was that the pound was going into free fall, and that would have dire financial and economic consequences. Now, part of the second strand is the sterling balances, and part of the instability of sterling was because of the large holdings of sterling by overseas holders in the reserves of a number of countries. And the danger was that these reserves would be dumped as sterling fell in order for those holders not to incur the depreciation of their reserves, and that the pound would go into free fall. And this would then trigger some extreme response, possibly capital controls, possibly import controls, and even a British default on its external debt. In fact, the US Treasury was concerned that Britain might default on its debt. It was that bad. Third element was a debt crisis. The government had run out of road in terms of borrowing. The international capital markets were closed because of the uncertainty over the policy and the lack of confidence in government policy and uncertainty about the position of sterling. It had run out of an ability to borrow domestically. There was what was called the gilt market strike, and potential purchasers, institutional purchasers of government paper, were simply refusing to buy. By September 1976, the IMF was literally Britain's lender of, or potential lender of last resort. And finally, there was a political crisis. Now, this revolved around divisions within the ruling Labour Party cabinet between the centrist leadership and the left of the party. There was a small but influential group, minority but influential group of left-wing cabinet members. And the cabinet and the leadership was concerned that the cabinet would refuse to endorse the application for the loan to the IMF. And in fact, on the 23rd of November, the cabinet rejected making that application, which had dire implications. However, the leadership was, through a number of twists and turns, able to win over a majority of the cabinet, and the loan was accepted. The left-wing members of the cabinet objected to the terms that the IMF was likely to impose for granting the loan, known as conditionality, but it was exactly this conditionality that the leadership and the markets were looking for. So, with the IMF's seal of approval, Britain was able to return to the global capital markets, and the situation was resolved. The 1976 IMF crisis was over.